The forest stretched endlessly, a vast maze of towering pines and thick underbrush. The scent of damp earth lingered in the crisp morning air, mingling with the distant call of a raven. Somewhere in the shadows, two small bear cubs wandered, their tiny paws sinking into the soft loam with each hesitant step. They were alone. The larger of the two, a brown-furred cub with curious eyes, stopped and sniffed the air. His heart pounded against his rib cage, not from exertion, but from something deeper, an unease he didn't understand. His sister, smaller and more cautious, pressed close to his side, her ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. They had been following their mother. Just the day before, she had led them through this very part of the forest, her massive frame a shield against the dangers that lurked beyond the trees. But now she was gone. The night before had been a blur of confusion. One moment, they were curled up beside her warm body, and the next, a sharp noise had startled them awake. Their mother had bolted up, sniffing the air with sudden intensity. Without warning, she had charged into the darkness, her powerful stride shaking the earth beneath them. They had waited. They had waited for hours, their tiny bodies huddled together for warmth. But she never returned. Now, the morning sun barely pierced through the dense canopy, casting long fingers of light across the forest floor. The cubs moved hesitantly, searching for any trace of her scent, any sign of her return. But the deeper they wandered, the more foreign their surroundings became. The comforting scent of their mother had vanished, replaced by the sharp, musky odors of unfamiliar creatures. A branch snapped in the distance. Both cubs froze. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds had stopped their morning chatter. The smaller cub whimpered, pressing against her brother's side. Something was watching them. The larger cub turned his head slowly, scanning the thick undergrowth. At first, he saw nothing but shadows shifting in the light. Then movement. A pair of glowing yellow eyes flickered between the trees. Another set appeared. And another. The wolves had found them. A low growl rumbled through the stillness, deep and menacing. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The pack had been trailing the cubs for hours, their sharp noses picking up the scent of vulnerability. They had watched, waited, and now, with the cubs straying too far from safety, they were ready to strike. The lead wolf stepped forward, his coat a mix of gray and black, his lean body tense with anticipation. His ears twitched as he gauged the distance, calculating the perfect moment to lunge. The cubs were no match for him. They had no mother to defend them, no claws sharp enough to fight back, no speed to outrun the pack. The larger cub let out a desperate, high-pitched growl, a weak attempt to appear bigger, stronger than he was. But the wolves weren't fooled. A second wolf crept forward, his jaws slightly parted, revealing rows of gleaming teeth. The pack began to spread out, circling the cubs, cutting off every possible escape. The smaller cub whimpered again, her fear now a tangible thing in the air. The lead wolf tensed his muscles, ready to pounce. And then, a sound shattered the moment. Not a growl, not a rustling of leaves. Something deeper, something primal. A roar, the kind that made even the most seasoned predators hesitate. The wolves froze, ears flicking toward the source. The cubs turned wide-eyed toward the darkness beyond the trees. Something was coming. Something far more dangerous than the wolves. And it was coming fast. The forest held its breath. The wolves, poised on the edge of their attack, hesitated. The cubs could sense their uncertainty, but it was a brief moment. Too brief to mean safety. The lead wolf, a grizzled alpha with scars crisscrossing his muzzle, turned his head toward the source of the roar. His ears flicked, his nostrils flared. A mother bear was a dangerous opponent, but she was nowhere in sight. He exhaled sharply, a sound somewhere between a snarl and a scoff. The pack had come too far to abandon their hunt now. With a quick jerk of his head, the alpha signaled the others to continue. The wolves resumed their slow, calculated approach, their paws pressing silently into the earth, their bodies sleek and low. The cubs backed away until they felt the rough bark of a tree at their backs. There was nowhere left to run. The smaller cub whimpered, her wide eyes darting between the shadows and the closing ring of predators. The larger cub let out another desperate growl, his tiny body trembling as he stood his ground. It was a futile effort. The first wolf lunge. The world seemed to slow in that instant. The cubs barely had time to flinch before. A deafening crack split the air. Not the roar from before. Something sharper. Closer. A massive shape hurtled through the trees, colliding with the attacking wolf mid-leap. A yelp of pain. A flurry of fur. And then silence. The other wolves recoiled, their eyes wide with shock. The alpha's ears pinned back, his muscles stiffening. This wasn't part of the hunt. Slowly, the dust settled, and from the undergrowth, a figure rose. Not a bear. Something else. The wolves stared. The cubs trembled. And then in the cold, still air, a single thought pulsed through the forest. The real hunt had just begun. The forest was no longer silent. The wolf that had lunged lay sprawled on the ground, whimpering as it struggled to rise. A dark figure loomed over it, its breath heavy, its presence radiating raw, uncontained power. The other wolves hesitated. They had faced many threats before, bears, moose, even rival packs. But this was different. This wasn't an ordinary animal defending its own. This was something else. The cubs, frozen in terror, couldn't see clearly through the tangled underbrush. But they knew one thing. Whatever had just arrived was their only chance to survive. The alpha wolf growled, his fur bristling as he weighed his options. His pack outnumbered whatever this was. But instinct told him that numbers might not be enough. Still, hunger gnawed at his ribs. The cubs were weak, easy prey. He wasn't leaving empty-pawed. With a sharp bark, he signaled the pack to spread out, circling both the cubs and the new intruder. If a fight was coming, he would make sure it was on his terms. The shadowy figure finally stepped into the light. The wolves stiffened. It was a bear, but not the cub's mother. This bear was a giant, towering over them all. His fur was dark, almost black, with scars running across his shoulders and muzzle, scars that spoke of battles won. His deep-set eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto the wolves with something worse than anger, indifference. He wasn't here to fight for dominance. He wasn't here to prove himself. He was here because something had interrupted his night, and now he had a decision to make. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the alpha wolf made his choice. With a vicious snarl, he charged, and the bear, unmoving, let him come. The impact was thunderous. The alpha clammed his jaws onto the bear's forearm, but the moment his teeth sank in, the bear moved. One massive swipe, effortless, almost lazy, sent the wolf flying backward, crashing into the underbrush with a pained yelp. The pack faltered. Their leader was down. The bear exhaled, stepping forward. He didn't need to roar. His sheer presence spoke louder than any threat. The wolves knew they had lost. One by one, they slunk back into the forest, their yellow eyes burning with frustration. The alpha, limping, cast a final glance at the cubs before vanishing into the darkness. And then, just like that, it was over. The cubs stood frozen, their tiny chests rising and falling in quick, panicked breaths. The giant bear turned his head, staring at them. A moment passed, then another, and then, without a sound, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as if he had never been there at all. The cubs were alone once more. But this time, they weren't just lost. They had seen what the wild was truly capable of, and they weren't sure they had just been saved or warned. The forest settled into an eerie quiet. The massive bear was gone. The wolves had retreated, but the cubs remained frozen in place, their tiny hearts pounding like war drums. The larger cub turned his head, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Was it truly over? Had they been spared by sheer luck, or was this just a calm before another storm? The smaller cub pressed close to him, shivering. She let out a soft, questioning whimper, her wide eyes searching for answers he didn't have. And then, a new sound, distant at first, faint, but unmistakable. Heavy footsteps. The cub stiffened. Was the bear coming back? Had he changed his mind? The larger cub strained his ears, listening beyond the rustling trees. No, these weren't the slow, deliberate steps of the scarred bear. These were faster, more urgent, familiar. And then, a deep, thunderous roar split the air. The cubs knew that sound. Their mother. The world around them blurred as they turned toward the noise. She was close. Without hesitation, they bolted toward the sound, their tiny legs carrying them through thick ferns and tangled roots. Twigs snapped beneath their paws, but they didn't slow. They ran, not just out of fear, but out of something deeper, hope, and then, just beyond the tree-line, they saw her. She was massive, her thick fur bristling with tension. Her muscles were coiled, her dark eyes scanning the area with razor-sharp focus. She had caught the scent of wolves, of blood, of fear. She had felt their absence. And now she was here. The moment her gaze landed on them, something in her softened, but only for a second. Then her nostrils flared, and her attention snapped toward the place where the wolves had stood. Her massive claws flexed, ready to strike. But the wolves were gone, and the bear who would save them? Nowhere to be seen. The larger cub stumbled forward, letting out a desperate, trembling cry. The smaller cub followed, whimpering as she pushed herself against their mother's warm fur. She huffed, nosing them both, her heavy breath washing over them in warm waves. She sniffed them thoroughly, as if making sure they were whole. And then, finally, she relaxed. For the first time since the attack, the cubs felt safe. But as their mother nudged them forward, leading them back to familiar territory, the larger cub glanced over his shoulder, back toward the place where the scarred bear had disappeared. Something about him still lingered in the cub's mind. Why had he helped them? Why had he walked away? And most unsettling of all, would they see him again? As the last rays of daylight filtered through the trees, the cub turned away and followed his mother into the depths of the forest. But the wild had changed them, and this would not be the last time they faced its wrath. The forest was no longer just a home. For the mother bear, it was now a battleground. She led her cubs forward, her powerful strides unyielding, her muscles tense beneath her thick fur. The scent of wolves still lingered in the air, sharp, bitter, and fresh. It burned in her nose, igniting something primal deep inside her. They had hunted her cubs, and that was something she would not forgive. The cubs, exhausted and shaken, struggled to keep pace. But they knew better than to fall behind. Their mother wasn't just moving. She was hunting. Each step was precise, calculated. Her ears twitched at every sound. The wolves were near. She could feel it. Then the wind shifted. Her nostrils flared. The scent was stronger now. Close. Too close. She stopped, her massive head lifting as she scanned the trees. Her cubs halted behind her, instinctively lowering themselves to the ground. They sensed it, too. Danger. And then, a growl. Not from her. Not from a wolf. From something else. The underbrush rustled, and out of the shadows, a familiar figure emerged. The scarred bear. The cubs tensed. He was even larger up close, his sheer size enough to send a shiver down their tiny spines. His dark eyes locked onto the mother bear, unreadable. The two bears stood motionless, facing each other, a silent standoff. The cubs could feel the weight of the moment, the air thick with unspoken tension. Then the scarred bear did something unexpected. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the trees behind him. The mother bear followed his gaze, and that's when she saw them. The wolves. They hadn't fled far. They were watching, waiting, calculating. The alpha, still bruised from his earlier encounter, stood at the front, his yellow eyes gleaming with something dangerous. The pack wasn't retreating. They were regrouping. And now, they weren't just after cubs. They wanted revenge. The mother bear growled, lowering her head, her teeth bared. She was ready to fight, ready to kill. But then, the scarred bear moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, placing himself between the mother and the wolves. The message was clear. This was his fight. The wolves hesitated, their ears flattening. They remembered him, remembered his strength. The alpha growled but did not advance. A choice hung in the air. A battle or survival. The wolves made their decision. One by one, they turned, slipping back into the shadows of the trees, their yellow eyes vanishing into the night. The alpha was the last to go, his gaze lingering on the scarred bear for one final moment before he disappeared. The danger was gone, but the mother bear's gaze never left the scarred bear. He had saved her cubs. Again. Why? The cubs, still huddled close, watched as the mother finally relaxed, the fire in her eyes dimming. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath. The scarred bear simply stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away. This time, the mother didn't follow. She simply watched. And in that moment, something passed between them. Something ancient, something unspoken. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. And as the forest returned to silence, the cubs realized something. They were not alone in this wild, because sometimes, even in the untamed wilderness, enemies could become something else. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The mother bear, her cubs pressed close to her side, led them deeper into the heart of the forest. The wolves had gone. The scarred bear had disappeared once more. But something still felt wrong. The larger cub glanced over his shoulder, his ears twitching at every rustling leaf. His sister whimpered softly, sensing the unease in the air. Their mother walked with purpose, her heavy steps careful, deliberate. She wasn't running, but she wasn't at ease either, because she knew something else was out there, watching, waiting, asterisk. She stopped at the base of a massive cedar tree, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the wind. The cubs stayed close, their tiny bodies trembling from exhaustion. They needed to rest, but the forest was too quiet. The usual sounds, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, had faded into an unnatural silence. And then, a snapping twig. The mother bear's head whipped around, her eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the trees. A deep growl rumbled in her chest. The cubs held their breath. Was it the wolves? Had they returned? No, this was something else. Something bigger. A hulking shadow moved between the trees. Silent, slow, too large to be a wolf. The mother bear tensed, stepping in front of her cubs, her massive frame of wall between them and the unknown threat. The scarred bear had vanished. But something new had arrived, and as the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent so foreign, so utterly unnatural, she knew this was no ordinary predator. This was something the wild itself feared, something that hunted even the hunters. And it had just found them. The mother let out a deep, warning roar, shaking the air around them. But in response, the shadow moved closer. The cubs pressed against their mother's legs, their tiny hearts hammering in their chests. The mother bear took a step forward, her claws flexing, her breath slow and steady. This was no longer about running. This was a fight she had to win, because this time there would be no escape. The wild had saved them once, but now it had sent something to take them back.